Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Keyser. This is the Son of Man Urantia Project. Today's episode is the final version of Chapter 18 of the book, Son of Man Urantia, available in either PDF or in book form at the lulu.com bookstore. The links are below. This is a one-shot deal. There's no editing. So if I make a mistake or one of the 14 rescue animals around here wake up, we're just going to deal with it and move on. Chapter 18, the 12 Apostles. We have been taught that the 12 apostles were uneducated, ignorant, and unlearned. In Jesus' time, that meant that they were laymen, common people who had jobs or trades, and who had not been formally trained in the scriptures like had a rabbi. But all of them, except the Alphaeus twins, had graduated from the synagogue schools, and 7 of them had graduated from the schools in Capernaum, considered the best in all of Galilee. Most of the apostles were well trained in the Hebrew scriptures and the current knowledge of that day, even though they were considered ignorant and unlearned by the Jewish priesthood. Jesus taught the apostles about the kingdom of heaven, and from his apostles, Jesus learned about humanity here and on the other worlds of time and space. Each of these men had different backgrounds and temperaments. They were not all alike because they had not been put through the same rigid and stereotyped education that people have today. Many of the Galilean fishermen carried Gentile blood because 100 years before, the Jews had forcibly converted the people in Galilee. The fact that only one apostle deserted him in the trials ahead says much about how charming and righteous Jesus must have lived his life among these men. Andrew, the first chosen. Andrew, who remained chairman of the apostles the entire time, was born in Capernaum. He was 33 years old, a full year older than Jesus, and the oldest of the apostles when he was chosen. Andrew came from a long line of excellent ancestors and was the oldest of 5 children, along with his brother Simon and their 3 sisters. His father, who was dead, had been Zebedee's partner in the fish drying business at Bethsaida, the harbor for Capernaum. When Andrew became an apostle, he was living with his brother, Simon Peter, and his wife. They were both fishermen and partners with the brothers John and James Zebedee. Andrew had the most skills and abilities of the 12 apostles. He was better at everything except public speaking. Jesus never gave Andrew a nickname, but before long, the rest of the apostles started calling him Chief, like they had started to call Jesus Master. Andrew was good at organizing, but better at administering the duties of his position. He would make a quick decision on problems unless he thought that they were beyond his authority, and in that case, he would take them straight to Jesus. Andrew was firm, clear, and logical when needed, but his major strength was his stability. He never wavered. What he did lack was any enthusiasm for praising the others, even when it was deserved. Andrew simply abhorred flattery and insincerity. He epitomized the self-made, all-around, even-tempered, and successful man of modest affairs. Andrew was one of Jesus' inner circle of 4 apostles, along with John, James, and Peter. But his responsibilities did not allow him to go off with Jesus when he prayed like the others could. Andrew was never an outstanding preacher, but he excelled in personal work, and he was Jesus' main supporter in his plan for the initial tour around the Sea of Galilee. When chosen, Andrew immediately brought his brother Simon into the fold, and that man became one of the most significant preachers ever of the kingdom of heaven. Andrew and Simon Peter were unalike in character and temperament, but to their everlasting credit, they get along like best friends. It was not often that an older man like Andrew, or it is not often that an older man like Andrew can exert such a profound influence over a younger and talented brother. But Andrew and Peter were the exceptions to the rule. They never seemed to be jealous of each other's achievements and proved that even brothers can live and work together peacefully. Late on the evening of the Pentecost, after 2,000 souls were added to the kingdom because of Peter's energetic and inspiring sermon, Andrew told Peter that while he could not have done that, he was glad to have a brother who could. And Peter returned the admiration, telling Andrew that if he had not brought him to Jesus and then kept him there, he would not have been there to do it. After that Pentecost sermon, Peter was famous, but it never bothered the older Andrew to spend the rest of his life being known and introduced as Simon Peter's brother. Of all the apostles, Andrew was the best judge of people. He knew that trouble was brewing in Judas Iscariot long before the others suspected that something was wrong with their treasurer. But he never told them of his fears. Andrew's great service to the kingdom was in advising John, Peter, and James concerning the choice of the first missionaries who were sent out to announce the gospel, and also in counseling these early leaders on administering the affairs of the kingdom. Andrew had a gift for discovering the latent talents of young people. While every one of the apostles loved Jesus, each was drawn to him because of some certain trait that had made him a special appeal, or that made a special appeal to that apostle. For Andrew, it was Jesus' dignity and sincerity that he admired the most. Once men got to know Jesus, they wanted to share him with their friends and let the whole world know about him. Soon after the resurrection, Andrew began writing a personal journal of Jesus' life. After Andrew himself was killed, copies of his private record were made and freely given to the early teachers of the Christian faith. Andrew's informal notes were then later edited until they made up a fairly consecutive story of Jesus' life on earth. The last of these few altered copies was destroyed in a fire at Alexandria about 100 years after Andrew wrote the original. Later, after the persecutions had scattered the apostles far from Jerusalem, Andrew traveled through Armenia, Asia Minor, and Macedonia. He brought many thousands of people into the kingdom before he was finally apprehended and crucified in Pitri in Achaia. It took the robust Andrew 2 full days to die on the cross. And throughout all of these tragic hours, he continued to announce the kingdom of heaven and bring new souls to God. Simon Peter. When Simon joined the apostles, he was 30 years old. He was married, had 3 children, and lived at Bethsaida near Capernaum. His brother Andrew and his wife's mother lived with his family. Both Peter and Andrew were fishermen and partners with Zebedee's sons. Jesus had known Simon for some time before Andrew suggested him as the second apostle. When Jesus named Simon Peter, he did it with a light-hearted smile, meaning it to be sort of a nickname, because Simon was well known to be erratic and impulsive. Still, it is true that later on Jesus did attach new and significant importance to what he lightly bestowed on Simon. Simon Peter was an impulsive optimist. He had grown up indulging his strong feelings and letting everything inside out. He was always getting into trouble because he kept speaking without thinking. His thoughtlessness also made trouble for his friends, and at times Jesus had to kindly scold him for it. The only reason Peter's mouth did not cause him more trouble was because early on he had learned the first talk with Andrew before taking off on a tangent. Peter was a dramatic and eloquent preacher. He was also a natural and inspirational leader. Peter was a quick thinker, but not a deep thinker. He asked many questions, more than all of the other apostles put together. But while most of them were relevant, there were many that were foolish and thoughtless. While Peter's mind was not complex, he did know himself fairly well. Because of this, he was known for quick decisions and sudden action. For example, while the others were talking about how astonished they were to see Jesus on the beach, Peter just jumped off the boat and swam ashore to meet his master. The one trait that Peter most admired about Jesus was his exceptional tenderness. He often thought about Jesus' patience and tolerance, and he never forgot Jesus' lesson about forgiving a wrongdoer not only 7 times, but 70 times and 7. He thought about his master's forgiveness during those dark and dismal days after he had denied him in the high priest's courtyard. Simon Peter would suddenly swing from one extreme to the other. For example, at first he refused to let Jesus wash his feet, and then on hearing the master's reply, he begged Jesus to wash him all over. Still, Jesus knew that Peter's faults were in his head and not in his heart. He was one of the most unexplainable combinations of courage and cowardice that had ever lived on earth. His noblest strengths of character were loyalty and friendship. Peter truly loved Jesus. But despite his huge devotion to Jesus, he was so unstable and inconsistent that he even let a servant girl tease him into denying his Lord and Master. Peter could withstand persecution and any other form of direct assault, but he could just not handle being ridiculed. He was a brave soldier when facing a frontal attack, but he was a fear-cringing coward when surprised with an assault from the rear. Peter was the first of Jesus' apostles to defend Paul's work with the Gentiles and Philip's work with the Samaritans. But then later at Antioch, he reversed himself when he was ridiculed by some Jews, which then brought down Paul's wrath on him. Peter was the first apostle to make a wholehearted confession of Jesus' combined humanity and divinity. And yet at the same time, he was the first apostle, except for Judas, to deny him. It was not that Peter was so much a dreamer. He just wanted to indulge his ecstatic and enthusiastic side instead of handling the plain and matter-of-fact duties of the real world. When following Jesus, he figuratively or literally walking down the road, Peter was either leading the charge or trailing way behind. After his rash denials of Jesus, Peter found himself with Andrew and the others back at the fish nets while they waited to learn what was going to happen after the crucifixion. When Peter was completely sure that Jesus had forgiven him, and he knew that he was still one of his apostles, the fires of the kingdom burned so brightly in his soul that he became a great and saving light to thousands who sat in darkness. Peter was the outstanding preacher of the 12, and he did more than any other single person, except for Paul, to establish the kingdom of heaven and send its messengers to the four corners of the earth in one generation. Something of Peter's style and teaching is shown in the sermons partially recorded by Luke and in the Gospel of Mark, but his vigorous style was better shown in his first epistle of Peter, at least before it was altered or later altered by one of Paul's disciples. After leaving Jerusalem and before Paul became the leader of the Gentile Christian churches, Peter traveled extensively, visiting all of the churches from Babylon to Corinth. He even helped many of the churches that had been formed by Paul. Although Peter and Paul differed much in their education and temperaments, even in their theology, they worked together in harmony with one another to build churches during their later years. But Peter persisted in making the mistake of trying to convince the Jews that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. Right up to the day of his death, Simon Peter was confused between ideas of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, Christ as the world's Redeemer, and the Son of Man as the revelation of God, our loving Father. Peter's wife was a strong and capable woman. For years, she was a member of the Women's Corps, and then when Peter was driven out of Jerusalem, she went with him on all of his missionary excursions. When Peter was finally caught by the Romans and condemned to die on the cross like Jesus had been, a sentence he considered to be a high honor, his loyal wife was fed alive to the wild beasts in the arena at Rome. James Zebedee. James, the oldest of the Zebedee's sons, was 30 years old when they became apostles. These two had known Jesus longer than the others, and he nicknamed them the Sons of Thunder. James was married, had 4 children, and lived near his parents on the outskirts of Capernaum. He and his brother John, along with Simon and Andrew, all made their livelihoods fishing together. James was a contradiction when it came to his temperament. It was almost like he was 2 different people at times, and both of them were bound by strong feelings. When he became angry, his fiery temper would let loose a hurricane. Then he would find a way to justify his anger and put it off to righteous indignation. But other than those times, he was much like Andrew, except without Andrew's discretion or insight into human nature. James was also a better public speaker than Andrew, being right up there with Peter and Matthew as the best of the 12. James would be a fantastic storyteller one day, and then quiet and reserved for days at a time. These spells of unaccountable silence were his one critical weakness. The one thing about Jesus that James admired the most was his interest in and sympathy for everything regardless of how small or huge, rich or poor. James's outstanding feature was his ability to see all sides of a situation. Of the 12, he came the closest to grasping the importance of Jesus' teaching. And by the time they ended their training, he understood Jesus' lessons better than the others. He could get along with a wide range of personalities, from the versatile Andrew to the impetuous Peter, to his self-contained brother, John. James was a well-balanced thinker, and along with Andrew, one of the more level-headed of the apostles. He did what needed to be done, but he was never in a hurry doing it. He was the perfect balance for Peter. Though John and James had trouble working together, it was inspiring to witness how well they did get along. They did not do as well as Peter and Andrew, but they did much better than most brothers, especially ones as headstrong and determined as these two were. They liked each other and had played well together as kids. When it came down to it, they were more tolerant of each other than they were of strangers. After all, these were the sons of thunder, who wanted to call down fire from the heavens to destroy the Samaritans for disrespecting their master. But James's untimely death tended to quench his younger brother's intensity. James was modest and undramatic. He worked every day without drawing attention to himself, and once he had grasped part of the real meaning of the kingdom, he never sought special rewards. In the story about John and James's mother asking Jesus if her sons could sit on his right and left-hand sides, she did that, not them. John and James also knew the consequences of following Jesus. When he asked them if they were ready to drink the cup, they both said they were. And with regard to James, that literally happened. He was the first apostle martyred when he was killed early on by Herod Agrippa's sword. Herod feared James more than all of the other apostles, because even though he was quiet, he was brave and determined when he stood for his convictions. James was thus the first of the 12 to sacrifice his life on the new battle lines of the kingdom. James lived a full life, and when they killed him, he bore himself with such grace and fortitude that even his accuser, the man who had informed on him and who was at his trial and execution, was so impressed that afterwards he joined Jesus' disciples. John Zebedee. John was 24 years old and the youngest of the 12 when he became an apostle. He was single, living with his parents at Bethsaida, and fishing with his brother James, along with Peter and Andrew. Both before and after becoming an apostle, John was Jesus' personal helper for taking care of his mother and family. He held this responsibility after Jesus' resurrection until Mary died. Shortly after Jesus appointed Andrew director of the group, he told Andrew to assign 2 or 3 of the apostles to always be with him for comfort and to get him his daily needs. Andrew decided that it was best for him to assign this duty to the 3 apostles that were chosen right after he had been chosen. Andrew wanted to be part of this group, but he already had his job, so he immediately assigned Peter, John, and James as Jesus' personal assistants. Since John was the youngest of the 12 and so closely involved with Jesus' family affairs, he was dear to Jesus. But it is not completely true where it is said that John was the disciple that Jesus loved. Jesus did not have favorites or love some of his apostles more than the others. This idea came from the fact that John was one of Jesus' 3 personal aides, and that he and his brother James had known him longer than the others. John Zebedee had many good traits, but he was also conceited, even if he did hide it well. His long-time friendship with Jesus had changed John for the better in many ways, and for a while it lessened his conceit. But later in life, after he grew old and became a bit childish, it returned. When John was telling Nathan what to write in the Gospel of John, he continually referred to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. Given that John had come closer to being Jesus' best friend than any other person on earth, and that he had been entrusted with so many of Jesus' personal affairs, it was to be expected that he thought of himself as the person most loved by Jesus, even if, in truth, Jesus loved all of them equally. John's greatest strength of character was dependability. He was prompt and courageous, devoted and faithful. His biggest problem was his conceit. It was possible that by being the youngest in his family and the youngest of the apostles, that John was just a bit spoiled and had been humored a bit too much in his life. Regardless, the later John was a different person than the self-admiring and erratic young man who joined Jesus' ranks when he was 24 years old. What John liked most about Jesus was his love and unselfishness. These traits made such an impression on John that the rest of his life was dominated by love and brotherly devotion. He talked about love and wrote about love. This son of thunder became the apostle of love. At Ephesus, when our aged bishop could no longer stand and preach and had to be carried to church in a chair, he would be asked to say a few words to the believers at the end of the service. And for years, the only thing he said was, "My little children, love one another." John did not say much except when his temper was aroused. He had a creative imagination, and while he thought much, he said little. As he grew older, his temper lessened, but he never did become one to speak more than absolutely necessary. John was also somewhat bigoted and intolerant. In this respect, he and James were alike. They both wanted to call down fire from heaven on the heads of the disrespectful Samaritans. And later, when John came across some strangers teaching in Jesus' name, he promptly forbid them from doing so. But he was not the only one of the 12 that thought he was better than everyone else. John's life was influenced by seeing how Jesus conducted his business without having a home, especially knowing how faithfully he had taken care of his mother and family. John also sympathized with Jesus because of his family's failure to understand him, and he knew that they were gradually withdrawing from him. This entire situation, together with Jesus always deferring his slightest wish to the will of the Father in heaven and living his daily life only on implicit trust, made a profound impression on John and produced permanent changes in his character, changes that manifested themselves throughout his later life. John was cool, daring, and courageous, traits few of the other apostles possessed. He was the one apostle who went with Jesus the night of his arrest and dared to go with him into the very jaws of death. John was nearby, right up to Jesus' last hour on earth, ready to receive whatever instructions he was given in Jesus' last moments. One thing is certain, John was thoroughly dependable. John usually sat on Jesus' right side when the 12 ate, and he was the first of the apostles to believe Jesus had been resurrected, and he was the first to recognize Jesus when he came to them on the seashore after his resurrection. John helped Peter on the Pentecost worked closely with him in the early Christian movement and became a chief supporter of the Jerusalem church. Several years after James was martyred, John married his brother's widow, and for the last 20 years of his life, he was taken care of by a loving granddaughter. John was placed in prison several times, and for 4 years he was banished to the Isle of Patmos, until another emperor came to power in Rome. If John had not been tactful and sagacious, where his brother James had been brash and outspoken, he would have been killed right along with him. Over time, John, along with Jesus' brother James, learned how to deal with the civil magistrates when they appeared before them. They learned that a soft answer worked best, and to represent the church as a spiritual brotherhood devoted to the social service of humanity, rather than as the kingdom of heaven. They were teaching loving service rather than ruling power, king and kingdom. When John was exiled on Patmos, he wrote the book of Revelation, which has been vastly abridged and distorted over time. What we now call the book of Revelation only contains the surviving fragments of a much more impressive revelation, large portions of which were lost and others that were removed or changed after John wrote it. After John became the bishop of the Asian churches, he settled down at Ephesus when he was 99 years old and oversaw his associate, Nathan, who wrote the so-called Gospel according to John. Of the 12 apostles, John Zebedee eventually became the outstanding theologian. He died of natural causes at Ephesus in AD 103, when he was 101 years old. Philip the Curious. Philip was the 5th chosen apostle. He was brought into the group when he and Nathanael happened to meet Jesus, John, James, Peter, and Andrew on their way to Cana from John's camp on the Jordan River. Philip was 27 years old, lived in Bethsaida, and was recently married, but still without children. He knew about Jesus, but it had never occurred to him that he was special until Jesus looked at him and said, "Follow me." He was also influenced by the fact that the other 4 had already accepted Jesus as the deliverer. Philip earned the nickname that meant more or less curiosity because he always wanted to be shown everything. It was not that he was dull. He was just a commonplace, matter-of-fact individual who could not visualize things like could some of the other apostles. Philip was made steward of the apostles. It was his duty to see that they always had enough to eat and to take care of their daily needs. He did his duties well. He was thorough, methodical, and systematic, with a good handle on the math needed for his job. Philip was the next to the oldest of a family of 3 boys and 4 girls. His family also fished for a living, and after the resurrection, Philip baptized all of his family into the kingdom. His mother came from a mediocre family, but his father was a deep thinker and a capable man in many respects. While Philip was not a man who could be expected to do big things, he was a man who could do little things well and in a big way. He managed the apostles' commissary efficiently and intelligently. There were only a few times in 4 years that he did not have enough food on hand to feed the group. Philip's strong points were being reliable and methodical. His weak point was his utter lack of imagination. He was mathematical, but not constructive, being more the average commonplace man of the times. But this was good for people to see, and it gave them the courage to believe. Philip was like most of them. It brought the masses important peace of mind to see that a normal, everyday person like themselves was included in Jesus' counsels on the affairs of the kingdom. And Jesus, in turn, learned how our human minds operate as he patiently listened to Philip's foolish questions and dealt with his need to be shown proof of everything. The trait that Philip admired the most, or in fact actually worshiped about Jesus, was his generosity. He could never find anything about Jesus that was in any way small, stingy, or niggardly. Philip was not an impressive man. He was often known as Philip of Bethsaida, where Peter and Andrew live. Philip had almost no ability to visualize the possibilities of any given situation. He was not pessimistic. He simply did not have a mind complex enough to see ahead. He also lacked much in the way of spiritual insight. It did not bother him in the least to interrupt Jesus in the middle of a deep discussion to ask what the others thought was a foolish question. But Jesus never scolded Philip for interrupting him or asking his questions. Jesus knew that for Philip, these were honest questions, and that if he was to reprimand him even one time for asking them, it would hurt his feelings to the point that he would never again feel free to ask another. Jesus knew that on his worlds of time and space, there were many billions of similar people, and he wanted them all to freely come to him with their problems and questions. Jesus' greatest interest was in knowing people, all types of people, and he was actually more interested in Philip's questions than in the sermon he may have been preaching when interrupted. Philip was not a good public speaker, although he was persuasive and successful in his personal work. He did not get discouraged easily and kept at whatever job he had until it was done. Philip had that rare gift of saying, "Come," like when his first convert, Nathanael, wanted to argue about Jesus' qualities, and all Philip said was, "Come and see." He was not a dogmatic preacher who told people to go and do something. Instead, in all situations, he would tell people to come with me, and I will show you the way. And that is always the best way to teach. Even parents can learn from Philip, and instead of telling their children not to do something, they would get better results telling them to come with me, and I will show you a better way. Philip's inability to adapt to a new situation was shown when the Greeks came to him at Jerusalem and wanted to see Jesus. Philip would have said to any Jew asking such a question, "Come." But these men were foreigners, and Philip could not remember any instructions on what to do in this case. The only thing he could think of was to tell the chief, Andrew, and then they both went and took the Greeks to Jesus. Likewise, when Philip went into Samaria to preach and baptize people, like Jesus had instructed him to, he would not touch those believers as a sign of them receiving the Spirit of truth. John and Peter did this later, when they came down from Jerusalem for the mother church to watch Philip's work. After Jesus' resurrection, Philip helped with the reorganization of the 12 apostles, and he was the first to go out and baptize people outside of the immediate Jewish ranks. He was successful working with the Samaritans and in all of his later efforts on behalf of the kingdom. Philip, the one-time steward of the 12, was a mighty man in the kingdom and won souls wherever he went. His wife, who was a member of the women's corps, worked with him spreading the gospel after they had to flee from the persecutions in Jerusalem. She was a fearless woman, and when Philip was finally crucified at Hierapolis, she stood at the foot of his cross, encouraging him to announce the glad tidings, even to his murderers. When Philip's strength failed and he could no longer speak, she began to recite the story of salvation by faith in Jesus, until a group of angry Jews stoned her to death. Her eldest daughter, Leah, continued their work, later becoming the renowned prophetess of Hierapolis. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of part 1 of chapter 18, the 12 Apostles. Part 2 will come up next. And that's it. Defend liberty. Protect the innocent ones. Get out there and find some way to serve humanity for nothing more or less than the sake of God. Bobby Keyser, out here.